Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my 2024 NACL Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Super excited to get into this one. As you guys know, the NACL is probably my favorite league to watch in the entire world. I talk about it a lot on this channel. Not only am I obviously a huge fan of the development system in North America and seeing these young players get to grow and seeing which of them could be the next superstars up in the LCS, but I mean, just from a gameplay perspective, it is just so fun to watch the NACL. If you are a new viewer to the NACL, somebody who's checking it out this split, maybe because of some of the new additions in terms of the orgs, first of all, welcome, but also you are in for a treat. This is some of the most fun competitive League of Legends gameplay that you are going to get. This has been called the Salt League for a reason. There's a lot of trash talk, there's a lot of camaraderie, there is a lot of fun games. Fearless Draft, especially full Fearless now going into this split, really makes it a lot more interesting. I'm super excited to talk about it. The 10 teams are all really interesting in their own right, and I'll kind of get into how I'm going to rank these teams a little bit later, but I usually don't ask for this at the beginning of videos. This is a bit of an exception because this is the primer video. This is the biggest video that I will make for the NACL, basically for the rest of the year. I'm going to ask this at the beginning. If you do find yourself enjoying it, maybe not now, but in 10, 20, 30 minutes, if you find yourself enjoying the video, it really would mean a lot to me if you left a like. We put a lot of time and effort, not only in watching, every single game from the new players and new teams that are in the league that are coming in either through promotion or, buying a spot, something like that, but also we go back and watch a lot of the games from the NACL to kind of make sure we can reevaluate those players and make sure our evaluations were correct the first time around. So a lot of time and effort goes into these primer videos. If you find yourself enjoying them, it really would mean a lot to me if you left a like on the video. It helps out a lot more than you know. But with that being said, let's jump right into the content. A bit of a preamble. The first thing I always want to say, and this is especially true when it comes to the NACL, this is, at the end of the day, just my opinion. These are just going to be my thoughts on these players, and specifically for the NACL as opposed to like the top tier regions. A lot of the rankings that I'm going to do in this video, not only for the players, but for the teams as well, are going to be floor rankings. I really think that anybody could have top 1, top 2 upside. That's the fun of the NACL, is that the whole point of it existing is that these players are going to change and get better as the split continues to move along. Some players are going to rise to the top, they're going to progress, they're going to develop. Some players might not develop as much, but might have a higher floor. I'm going to be doing floor rankings throughout a majority of this video, which means when you see a number on the screen, or if you see a team ranked in a certain place, that's where I think their personal floor is in terms of my rankings. So even if I do think a team has the upside to get top 2 or top 3, if everything goes right, I might have them ranked number 5 or number 6 because I could see a world in which they underperform maybe more so than the teams above them. I hope that makes sense, and that's going to apply to the players as well. If you see a player ranked number 2 or number 3 in their role, they're probably going to be a pretty consistent player, somebody that I'm not particularly worried about, someone that I think will be a positive to their team. But that does not mean that someone ranked number 6 or 7 or 8 or even 9 or 10 couldn't be a major positive to their team as well if development goes their way. It just means that they're slightly less proven. I'm not going to do letter grades for this video. I typically do letter grades in terms of, evaluating these players, but I feel like it does defeat the purpose of an NACL, like a developmental league, a tier 2 league. I feel like it defeats the purpose to say this is how good this player is and this is how good they will be, because that's not really how the league works. That's not how the league is structured to work. So I am just going to rank these in terms of their positions, and generally I will speak on the strength of each team and the strength of each player as we go through, but we will be going from number 10 to number 1 in my power rankings, talking about every team, their playstyle, their expectations. I'll be ranking every single player inside their own individual role from number 10 to number 1. So, you'll see where each player and each team kind of stacks up. Some roles are stronger than others, but for the most part, the NACL is pretty well balanced, more so than a lot of the major regions in terms of the depth of talent at each position. So, big preamble out of the way. I know it's 4 minutes, but it does take some time to get into that kind of stuff and make sure that we're all on the same page. But now we finally get to jump into my number 10 team, the team that I believe is going to come in the back half, the lowest floor, in my opinion, in these power rankings, and it is going to be one of our promoted teams. It's going to be Blue Otter, and I'm really excited to see Blue Otter in the league. They had an awesome run in the qualifiers where they were really exciting to watch, and they are one of the few teams that gets promoted to the NACL and actually doesn't change a majority of their roster. 3 of the 5 members of that team are returning, which is incredibly exciting. You just have to be excited to see Music, Samikin, and Rovex back. They did really well in the qualifiers to get here. That team was surprisingly strong. They took down some good rosters. Winthrop, they took down Lit to qualify for this. Hell, they even beat the Mirage Alliance, who was, of course, a team that, was down in the tournament from the NACL. This is a surprisingly good team, and I think the additions in the other roles are actually positives as well. So we'll go over it. Their lineup is looking like Quacker in the top lane, Music in the jungle, Samikin in the mid lane, Levitate at AD carry, and Rovex at support. This is a surprisingly good lineup for a team that just got promoted. It is really hard to really be a contender at the NACL level when you are just, coming up. But the only concern I have with this team is that there isn't a lot of experience from a lot of these players at this level. Players like Samikin, Levitate, they don't have the most experience. These are players that they're going to rely on a lot, but man, mechanically speaking, this team has it. This team could be top 6, maybe top 5. They could be in that range if everything were to go right. I think talking about the players that are the most experienced is a good place to start, and that really starts with Quacker, who of course has a lot of time at this level. He's played for Supernova, he's played for Wildcard this previous split. Wildcard obviously not in the league anymore. Quacker is definitely a player that I've had on my radar for quite a while. He's going to come in as the highest ranked player on the team because, again, I think his floor is relatively high. He's going to come in as the number 6 top laner. I think that's pretty fair. He has shown a lot of flashes of being a very versatile and, quite frankly, dangerous top laner to play into. He can take over any game and win it for your team. He is going to have some performances where he's a little bit more inconsistent. That's the nature of a player like him who is a bit more feast or famine. I think that's a good way to describe Quacker. When he wins hard. When he loses hard, but the mechanics are there, and honestly, he's a bit more consistent than I think people give him credit for. Now, I don't think he had the best spring split of all time. Some of those bad games were a little bit too bad, but when you go back and look at that Supernova year last year, I think we see the upside. We see what Quacker can become, and especially if the rest of this team hits, I think Quacker could be really solid, and I think his connection to a couple of the other players on this team is really positive. He might not have been on Blue Otter for the qualification process, but 3/5 of this team kind of bridge the gap in terms of how they connect with the Immortals tournament. They all played on CCG, and Quacker was a part of that. Music and Levitate were also a part of that. These are players that have played together. It's not like he's not played with this jungler before. He played with him on Supernova last year, in the NACL, so I think Quacker is going to be just fine. He is probably the player I'm most looking at for being the carry of this team, but anybody can carry. There are a lot of options on this team. Music is the other player who's had, I would say, a significant run here in the NACL on Supernova last year. He was okay. I wasn't super blown away. I think the mechanics are there, but sometimes the decision-making can catch up. I generally don't feel bad about Music. Jungle's just really strong at the NACL level, and his floor is just a little bit lower than I would say some of the other junglers. I think his upside is very much there. Very interesting player, as we've talked about, on this channel before, but I'm not going to sit here and say that he's going to dominate immediately. He really wasn't a superstar the last time he was playing at the tier 2 level. And then the only other player I believe with NACL experience is Rovex, which some people might forget because he was on that Team Liquid first team that wasn't particularly good, but I think this bot lane has way more upside than the numbers on the screen would anticipate. I'm a really big fan of Levitate. I think he could come in and be a really big game changer. It's going to be weird to see him without Snow, but him and Rovex are really, really interesting as a duo because I think both of them have never really been given a fair shake at this level, and Levitate in particular is someone I've really wanted to see. Rovex is a good player, certainly not a lot to be negative about. I thought he was really good in the qualification tournament, but I'm really excited to see if this bot lane can be strong in the 2v2. That's something that I think both of these players are very much capable of. Levitate can be a late game carry if necessary. Generally, I just think this bot lane could be good. Low floor, though. Again, these are players that either have not been given a shot at this level, Levitate's not been given a shot at this level, or Rovex, who has been and has not been on particularly good teams. And so definitely a lot to prove in the same way that Music has a lot to prove. And then you've got Samikin in the mid lane. And honestly, if this team is going to break through that expectation, I think Samikin's going to be a big part of that. This guy's crazy. Watching him in the qualifiers, it is very clear his mechanical ceiling is ridiculously high. It was super fun to watch him 1v1 in lane. I think he's got a good head in terms of understanding where he needs to be in the mid game, when to kind of sacrifice resources to help out his jungle or to help out somebody else on the map. I think there's a lot to like about Samikin in terms of, what he offers for this team, and he was the one player that I would have been a little bit upset if they didn't end up keeping him, in the qualification process. I was really, really enjoying watching him play, and I'm really excited to see what he can do. We've seen tier 3 mid laners get promoted. We've seen kind of the gambit of successes. We've seen failures. Toasty's a great example of what can happen when things go right. As we saw this past split, Toasty was really good, but we've seen players that are amazing at the CLOL or the tier 3 level just not be able to make it work as much in the NACL. Unfortunately, like someone like Robbie Bob comes to mind there. Not that I think he's washed or anything like that. I'm sure he could get another shot and look really good, but at least in his last attempt, it wasn't great. Someone like Getback, I think, is also in that, kind of situation. I don't think Samikin's in that camp. I think he's a lot closer to being someone like Toasty, whose mechanical skill can just make him relevant at this level incredibly quickly. I really do think Blue Otter's mechanical upside is there. Quacker, Music, Samikin, Levitate, Rovex. This is a scary team if they start to get going. The only concern for them and the reason they come in at number 10 is, again, they are kind of unknown. Quacker and Music are really the only two players with significant time at this level, and even then for Music, it was really only one split. And so Quacker's really the only veteran of tier 2, and that definitely concerns me. That being said, like, the upside of this team is real, and I really like the way they went about it, getting players that have played together and have played for this org before. Blue Otter seems very active on socials. They seem like they're very, fan forward, and I think that's going to be good for the league. They're certainly a fan favorite team very quickly, and I, for one, hope they end up overachieving these expectations. And then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings. Remember, bottom 2 is not the place that you really want to be. It means you have to requalify for your spot in the NACL going into next year. Not that that is entirely applicable. We don't even really know what the system is going to look like next year with all of the changes, but you still probably don't want to be bottom 2. But for me, coming in at number 9, just barely, it is going to be Winthrop University. I have them coming in at number 9. I feel like this team could be really, really good because there's a core here that I really like. There's really 2 cores here that I really like, but I just don't know if they have the same kind of floor as the other teams that I'm talking about. I could absolutely see them, like I said with Otter, getting top 6 or something like that if everything were to go right, because there are a couple players on this team that are super good, and one lane in particular that I think could be absolutely devastatingly good if things end up going right. But again, this is a floor ranking. I could absolutely see this team not working out as well. A couple of players that either have limited experience at this level or have not been particularly phenomenal at this level. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is, at the moment, looking like Denethor in the top lane, Winnie in the jungle, Darkwings in the mid lane, Aaron at AD carry, and Sword at support. Of course, they've got other options here. They still have Wakao in the jungle. He is still here. I imagine he's definitely going to be an option to start there. They still have mobility at the AD carry role, but as I am aware of right now, it seems they brought in kind of the slew trio in the middle of the map, the wild card trio of Winnie, Darkwings, and Aaron, to start in the middle of the map for them while they move Sword down into the support position. He has obviously played there before, but he's been a mid laner the entirety of this year up until this point. And then, of course, you're kind of, like I said, you're complementing that slew wild card trio with 2 of your own guys from the CLOL Championships, Denethor, Sword, 2 players that have been in this organization, or I guess this university, for a little bit of time. And, I'm excited to see what happens. The slew trio obviously coming off of a pretty massive win at the CLOL Championships. They are your CLOL champions. I feel pretty proud for being able to predict that, but a lot of it had to come down to these players playing really well in some pretty high pressure situations. I think when you're looking at kind of how these players transitioned not being perfect in the NACL playoffs, getting 8th place on wildcard into a really good tournament run, a really incredible lower bracket run for Slew at that tournament, I think a lot of people are going to be looking at Aaron, and that's kind of the first direction I'm going to look as well. Really, the lane that I think could push this team over the top is Aaron and Sword if things end up going right. Aaron is really, really talented, and if there weren't a lot of really good bot laners in the NACL, Aaron would rank a lot higher on this list. I actually feel really good about him coming in and starting here if he is going to be starting over Mobility. I think he is better than Mobility, not by a ton. Mobility is a good player, and I'm not trying to say anything negative about that. He certainly is good enough to start in the NACL. I just think Aaron's really, really good. It's just really hard. Like, number 9 feels like such a disrespectful ranking, but as we'll see with like who comes in at number 7 and 8, like these are established, really good players at a tier 2 level, players that have even played at the LCS level before coming in above him just barely. So, I can't really rank Aaron too high because AD carry is so strong in tier 2 right now, but trust me, I really, really value Aaron, and I think him and Sword could be very dangerous. Sword role swapping back to support. He's obviously a lot more comfortable in the mid lane. It's clearly the direction he wants to take his own career, but, a support hole opened up for Winthrop, and Sword was the one who ended up up filling that. He is a good support. He has been a good support in the past. One of the things that I've always really valued about Sword, he might not be like crazy mechanical, like a mechanical god. I think he is really good. He has good mechanics and he's good in the 1v1 when he was in the mid lane, but really what I value him for is that he is a really smart player. His macro is incredibly good and his ability to time roams at a really good time for his team. Like, it's better than a lot of the other mid laners at this level, and it's better than a lot of the other supports at this level as well. It's what allows him to switch between those two roles so easily. So I think Aaron and Sword could be very dangerous. I'm not sure if the 2v2 is going to be like dominant, but I really do think that Sword could be a very proactive support, and Aaron can carry games. Like, I feel good about that. And then Winnie and Darkwings, they've been together for what feels like forever now as a mid-jungle duo. I'm a fan of Darkwings, kind of. He's become more of a feast or famine player as he spent more time in the scene. He kind of came in through that Dignitas system, and it was like, oh, they might have accidentally found a player here. Not that the Dig system was bad. They always had a relatively good Challengers team, but, you know, he was relatively unknown, and he turned out to be a really fun player to watch for them. And then, you know, he's just become a little bit more of that, I'm going to carry or I'm going to lose the game kind of mentality. I still think he can get to those more consistent, like, results. I think that is definitely still possible for him. We know he has that talent in him, and obviously I've been a fan of his on this channel in the past, but right now it is still a little bit more like, okay, which version of Darkwings are we going to get on a game-to-game basis? And Winnie is a very similar story. In fact, I don't think Winnie had a particularly great spring in terms of his NACL run. He was awesome for SLU in their CLOL championship run, which is why I want to continue to, like, believe in Winnie. We've seen him, you know, even play at the LCS level before. We know he has the tools to be able to perform. I just have not felt like it's always come together throughout an entire regular season in the NACL. I think that that's definitely possible, and again, a lot of comfort on this team with him playing with Darkwings and Aaron again as champions. And then Denethor is really kind of the less known piece, I'll say, on the top side. He's the only player on this team who has not played in the NACL in Tier 2 before, but really interesting player. Carry-oriented player, definitely somebody who likes to side lane, likes to solo lane, likes to get those kills, likes to split push. That's really been something that I've noticed from Denethor watching a lot of tape. It's kind of a natural inclination for him. I think that fits well into the rest of this team if they do want to play like 1-3-1s. I think Darkwings can play that style well. He's a very good 1v1 player. His mechanics are solid. Aaron can also just win 4v4 team fights if you're able to pull top laners out around objectives. And so, you know, I think that that could work for this team, but again, unproven in the top lane, at least at this level. So as a floor ranking, he is going to come in at number 10. But Winthrop, I think, is interesting. Again, if you've got that core of players that feel comfortable playing together, that really have a lot of mechanical upside, specifically Aaron, Darkwings, and Sword, I think as a mechanical trio could be very dangerous to play into, especially, you know, Aaron and Sword. I think they could be a very dangerous bot lane duo if things go right. Like, there is real upside here. I think Winthrop has all the tools they need to not be bottom 2, but again, there are just a few more question marks when it comes to this roster than maybe some of the ones right above them. And then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings. This is where we start the, I guess, proposed playoff teams. At least I believe the format is still the same in terms of playoffs. And coming in at number 8 for me, it's the team that finished 8th in the regular season at the very least last split. It's AOE Esports coming in at 8. And I think this is a pretty fair ranking. They've got some pieces that I think could be really scary to play into. I think on a game-to-game basis, they can beat anybody. Like, this is one of those teams that I think has the kind of upside to surprise so many teams, to be a constant, like, oh, you weren't, like, paying attention for us, you didn't take us seriously enough, now we are going to beat you. But I don't know if they're going to have the consistency, and they certainly don't have the floor for me to feel good about putting them any higher than where I have them here at number 8. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Moose Hater in the top lane, NXI in the jungle, Cupic in the mid lane, Wixie at AD carry, and Breezy at support. This, like I said, is a super fun team. The upside of this roster, if everything were to go right, is kind of insane, because a couple of these players have played really well at this level in the past, have been top tier players at this level in the past, or at least have had top tier performances, but consistency, I imagine, is going to be shockingly low on this team. I can't really imagine a team that might be less consistent from a game-to-game basis than AOE. There are going to be performances that I think are going to look great, and some that I think are going to look bad, and I think I averaged them out here to around number 8, but this could easily be a bottom 2 team. This could be a team that shocks people and goes on like a top 4 run. Like, if everything were to go right, I don't think that's, you know, something I'm going to project to happen, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility, at least in comparison to, you know, other teams that are kind of around them. So let's talk about it. We'll start with the players that are, I guess, being retained from AOE here. The bot lane, Wixie and Breezy, are returning. This is a good call. Wixie announced his retirement and immediately was brought out of retirement like a month later. So shout out Wixie. I don't know if this is his final split. I know that was a bit of a funny kind of turning of events, but this bot lane's really solid. This is going to be one of the more consistent bot lanes in the league. I think especially when you look at a lot of these AD carries that can have more feast or famine games, I think having a bot lane that you can rely on in this kind of way is really positive. I've always been a big fan of both of these players. Wixie I've talked up a lot on this channel over the past, like 3 years, ever since we've been covering Tier 2 regularly. I've been hyping him up ever since the 100 Next days, if we're being entirely honest, and then Breezy is definitely someone that I have to rep. Breezy is somebody that I have, shouted out a lot. He was one of the first really great players to come out of ASU, so definitely got to be a bit excited about that, but Breezy has always been really good at this level, and I know number 7 honestly feels like a bit of a disappointing ranking for Breezy, more so than I think 6 for Wixie, but again, support's actually pretty good at this level. I think there's a lot of confidence in supports right now, and as much as I really like Breezy, there are some players that I think could be real difference makers, like LCS caliber players, as we continue to move up these rankings. So I do think Wixie and Breezy are a strength of this team. I do not think that they are a weakness, but they are going to be the consistency, if you will, and then everybody else is certainly going to be kind of up for debate. I think NXI is kind of in the middle somewhere. He can have those really amazing pop-off games, but he can also be a bit more inconsistent, specifically because we haven't seen him start in the jungle in a little while. He's been a support over the past year or so. Obviously, that's what we saw him as last time he was here in Tier 2 with Taco. I think he's still a good player, obviously somebody who at one time was looked at as one of the best prospects in North America coming out of that 100 Thieves system, seeing him as a player that could potentially become, a regular LCS starting jungler. He's played in the LCS for FlyQuest before, going back to that weird roster swap situation that happened for them a couple of years ago, but outside of that has never really been given like real LCS time and has not really maintained his status as one of the upper tier jungle prospects in North America. He's role swapped a couple of times now, and it's going to be interesting to see if he can come back and be, solid as a jungler. I have a pretty good feeling that he will. I feel pretty good about NXI, and he's going to come in at number 7 for me. I think he's a good player, even if we haven't seen him a ton at jungle in recent years. And then Moose Hater's the other player. He's coming back to competitive here, has not been playing for at least a little while. Of course, the last time we saw him was here in the NACL on Wildcard last year, and Moose Hater lived up to a lot of the hype when he was playing. He was one of the most aggressive and consequential top laners in the entire league. We have a lot of tops that I think fit into kind of the category of feast or famine, that fit into the category of like to pick these crazy counter picks, and when they lose hard. Moose Hater definitely fits that description. I was both 1 foot in and 1 foot out on Moose Hater when he was on Wildcard. I was more in just because the talent is absolutely there from a mechanical perspective. He can absolutely go toe-to-toe with anybody in the NACL. Like, he is an LCS caliber mechanical talent. He just makes some mistakes sometimes, and he doesn't really always know exactly when he's allowed to play aggressive and when he does have to play a bit safer. But if he's on, like, he can steamroll any team. Like, truly, he is talented enough to do that. We saw that on Wildcard. Like, there was MVP hype for him through the first couple of weeks of last year. So, really excited to see him back into competitive. Really, the biggest question mark about this team in terms of consistency is going to be mid lane. It's Cupic in the mid lane, somebody who, quite frankly, I just don't have anything to analyze. I don't watch solo queue as much as I used to. I know he's a top tier, like a high solo queue player. I know he's been challenger for quite a long time now, and I know that a lot of other mid laners or a lot of other supports kind of, talk about him pretty highly, but this is a guy who has basically no competitive experience. I've not watched a single competitive game of his in the mid lane. I've never seen him play the role, so I can't give you any analysis on him. I don't want to try and sit here and say he's going to be bad just because I haven't seen him. I don't think that's fair, and I don't want to tell you he's going to be good because I haven't seen him. I also don't think that's fair. I want to be honest and say that I really can't find any footage of him playing mid lane at a competitive level, so this is certainly a punt from AOE. We've seen teams bring in top tier solo queue players before and have it work out, not only here in NA, but in different regions as well. We just saw it with JD Gaming and Sheer. I'm not trying to compare the situations, but, solo queue, winning a lot in that area could absolutely be a very good way to show that somebody is a solid, sound player that can make it at this level. So I'm excited to see what he can do. I just can't really offer a ton of analysis towards it right now. But again, there is a lot to like about this team. There's a lot to be, like 1 foot in, 1 foot out on. Moose Hater and, NXI, I think could be a really interesting jungle mid duo. I think the solo lanes here could be really interesting to see, in terms of if they hit, that could be really huge for this team. And if they miss, I don't think this team, could be top 6. Like, if they're both not as good as we hope they would be, or if not, they're not consistent in any sort of way, this could be a bottom 2 team. I think that's realistic as well. I feel like Wixie and Breezy are going to be generally fine, but I don't know if there's any superstar, like, talent on this team. Moose Hater can definitely be that. I think that there is a chance that he kind of cleans things up and becomes kind of a superstar top laner for this team, but, there are just more consistent pieces on other teams, which is why, again, in a floor ranking, they rank a lot lower than, maybe some people would like to believe. I think this is going to be a roundabout where a lot of other analysts put them, so I don't feel too bad, but AOE is certainly interesting. You can definitely say that. And then moving on to number 7, and this is going to be the final kind of promoted team, the final new team here in the NACL, at least one that isn't just new in rebranding terms. It's CCG Esports, and this was the other team to qualify through the qualification tournament. I think they filled out their roster really well. They are retaining 2 members from their qualification team, top and support, Crimson and Trevor, who are both very solid players. Trevor in particular, somebody who's had experience at this level, but bringing in a core of players who clearly have some experience playing together. Of course, Shochi, Manui, and Trevor all coming from Fear last year in the spring split. Chad playing for Fear this split, and being somebody who's been around the scene for a long time, these players clearly have a lot of connections to each other and have played together before, and that can only be a positive for something like the NACL, where it does kick off relatively quick. So I guess we should go over the full roster. Their lineup is looking like Crimson in the top lane, Chad in the jungle, Shochi in the mid lane, Manui at AD carry, and Trevor at support. Like I said, a lot of synergy between these players, and that is a good thing. That's a reason why CCG is so high on this list for me. As a qualifying team, it's pretty difficult to be like top 7 predicted in your first split. That can sometimes be a little bit of a rough ask, but I do think CCG is certainly talented enough to get that done, and some of these rankings might even be a bit too low. I know that some of these players have performed above these rankings in the past, and I think it's super reasonable to expect that to happen once again. There are just some questions about whether or not that is actually going to happen. We're going to start with the player that I feel the most comfortable about. By the numbers, you should tell who that is. It's Shochi in the mid lane. If you followed this channel, you know how I feel about Shochi. You know I think he's an incredibly consistent, very strong mid laner at this level. I've been campaigning for him to get into the LCS for about a year now. Ever since that breakout split on Fear, it felt like him and Perry as a duo should have been in the LCS at the start of this year. Things didn't go super well for Supernova in their playoff run. They were really good in the regular season, and some people are going to forget that because they had to play against some of the best teams in the league in the playoffs. They had to play Team Liquid Challengers in their first round. Okay, that's a very unlucky draw. And then who do they get in the lower bracket? Maryville, who goes to the finals. Like, it's about as brutal of a draw as you could get. I think some people are going to write off some of those players because of that, but Shochi is still one of the best mid laners in the entire region, let alone in the NACL. Like, I think he could compete at a high level. One thing that Shochi really does well is that he is such a good laner, and he knows how to translate that into creating space for the rest of his team. It's a lot easier playing jungle when you have a mid laner like Shochi. It really just kind of opens up a lot more space. We've seen that for multiple different junglers. All of them, I'm not going to say having their best years with Shochi or their best splits with Shochi, but certainly, kind of re-breaking out with him as a mid laner. Perry, Kenvi this past split was definitely a good example of that. Shochi just kind of makes his junglers better, and I think that's a super valid trait to have because you're bringing Chad in, and I've been a little bit negative on Chad. I feel like I don't want it to come across that way. I don't really have negative opinions towards how good I think Chad is. I think he's just been in some awkward situations. I think Fear really overperformed, in my opinion, in the spring split, something that organization does super regularly. They get the most out of talent, but I don't think a lot of it was through jungle. He kind of just faded into the background for some of those games. Some of them he really popped off. Like, some of those games he was really, really good, but I don't know. I've just never been wowed by Chad. I think this is a phenomenal opportunity for him. I think this is a really good team. This might be one of the best teams Chad's ever played on in terms of the NACL, even going back to the Immortals days, where it just never really felt like he was surrounded with the kind of talent that he needed to be. I think him and Shochi, if they can form that dynamic duo jungle mid, which I think is super possible, that's when it starts to get super scary. Because Chad, when he gets rolling, Chad, when he gets a lead, is very, very dangerous. It's just been about the game-to-game consistency for me, but it's not just those two. I mean, Manui and Trevor getting back together as a duo in the bot lane, being reunited from spring of last year. This is when I would say Manui really broke out and Trevor really broke out as players in the NACL. Both of them have struggled a bit since then. Manui definitely didn't have the split he wanted on DSG. I think he was given a lot of expectation. That was a roster and a team that I think really wanted to win the NACL, and I just don't think it ever really came together for them. Again, AD carry is such a stacked role at the NACL level that Manui falls all the way down to number 7. This was somebody I was looking at as a clear top 3 AD carry going into the year. I don't even really view him all that differently. He still is kind of an upside AD carry pick, and I think getting him back with Shochi, getting him back with Trevor, I think that's going to be a positive for him overall. It's all about the growth for Manui, who we know is talented enough, but it's always really been a confidence thing for him. And then Trevor, like I said, really nice to see him get reunited here. He was one of the 2 to 3 best supports in spring of last year when there there were 17 teams in the NACL. He absolutely can get back to that. He is one of the 2 players to actually be on CCG when they qualified through the open qualifiers. Of course, the other 3 members that we just talked about were already in the NACL, but Trevor kind of getting back to this level, he's more than earned it. He is way too good to be playing at this level, or to be playing in Tier 3. He absolutely deserves Tier 2, and getting him back with Manui, I think that could be a huge positive. Really, the only unknown about this team is going to be Crimson in the top lane, the other player who qualified through CCG. And I think this is certainly interesting. He might have had some time and experience with, training with these guys. He's been in the Fear organization as a sub before, but really, he has been a CCG guy. He's not played a ton before this. Like, he played for Ambition a couple of years ago, but really, he was the CCG guy that they wanted to build around. And it's really cool to see him get promoted and, be a big part of that qualification process and get to stick with the team in the NACL. I think that there were other options available that could have been a bit more enticing, but because he's been on this roster all year, really one of the few players to have been on this roster all year, him and Trevor kind of being the core of this team, I think it's really cool to see them continue to move along and up here into the NACL. So overall, I think this team's actually really interesting. I think, again, as I've talked about with everybody, there's upside for all of the teams, even the teams that I would consider not top 6. I think top 6 are the teams that I feel very confident are going to be playoff teams. I think anybody in the bottom 4 could theoretically be a quote-unquote bottom 4 team, or a bottom 2 team, I should say, but I would really be shocked if it's CCG. I think the core of the team here is just too strong. And even if I don't really know what you're getting out of the top side of the map, and you're kind of hoping for Chad to be a little bit more consistent than he's been over the past couple of splits, I mean, the Fear core is just too good. Shochi, Manui, Trevor were so good on Fear. They were a top team in the NACL, and there's really no reason to believe that they couldn't do that again. I think CCG is going to be sneakily, of all of the teams that are kind of being undervalued right now, the team that is probably the most interesting. But then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is really where it starts for me to get to teams that I think have a legit shot to win the NACL. And I know number 6 feels like a very early place to start that in terms of power rankings. I don't think a lot of people are going to have 6 teams that they consider contenders, but honestly, it's just so hard for me to look at the rosters in the NACL and not see 6 teams that could theoretically win it if everything were to go right. This is basically the contenders section. Everything here and up is incredibly strong and should be expected to be in that zone. So who's coming in at number 6 for me in this floor ranking? Well, it's actually a team that, once again, finished poorly in the regular season, finished really, really strong in the playoffs. It's Team Liquid Challengers. It's just every single split. They continuously do the same thing. They underperform for a majority of the regular season. They figure things out in the best of 3s, and they really start to thrive in the best of 5s. They finished 3rd in the playoffs, and now they're moving down to number 6. I know that doesn't feel good. There are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I think generally speaking, this team's floor is just a little bit lower than some of the other teams, even if their upside is just as high. Remember, I think anything from this point onwards is like they're expecting to win the NACL. They're going into this year with the expectation to, at the very least, be top 2 or top 3 if everything were to go right. And I think they absolutely have the skill to do so. Again, I just think that some of their players are a little bit more inconsistent than maybe some of the other ones that we'll talk about for the rest of this video, but you can see the difference in how these players are graded as a whole across this team and why they are ranking in a bit higher than the teams that we had below them. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Jenkins in the top lane, Keel in the jungle, Roamer in the mid lane, Spawn at AD carry, and Kim down at support. Same lineup as Spring. They didn't make any changes, nor should they have made any changes. This was the right move to keep everything together. There was a lot of good, I would say, especially towards the end of the playoffs, especially towards the end of their run last split, that encouraged me that they were going to be better going into summer, that they can maybe be more consistent in the regular season. But when you go back and look at that regular season, when you go back and look at how a lot of those games and how a lot of those series ended up playing out, it wasn't particularly good for them. It was them and DSG that were continuously underperforming and losing to teams that they really had no business losing to. They went 9-12 in the regular season. Really not that great of a performance. A lot of, I guess you could say, question marks about some of the individual performances from these players, but the talent level on this team is absolutely certain. Like, there is no question marks about that. I am going to start with Roamer in the mid lane because it really does feel like he is the player that they brought in to be the star of the team, and obviously I was super high on Roamer going into the year as somebody somebody who does watch Challengers League regularly, who talks about the LCK regularly and, tries to follow that ecosystem as well. Roamer was somebody that I was really excited to see here in NA. It's funny because I thought Roamer was going to be easily the best mid laner in the NACL. What happened with Quad, where he came in and just kind of dominated everybody in lane and was just better than everybody 1v1, that's what I thought Roamer was going to be here for Team Liquid. Didn't obviously end up happening, but he still has the skill and the talent potential to be able to get there. It's always a question of whether or not a player feels comfortable in their current role, whether or not a player feels, comfortable in the current environment. Going from Korea to North America is not always the easiest change, and so it's always interesting to see how a player can adapt. I don't think Roamer was quite as strong out the gate as I was expecting, but he was really good in the playoff run, and I think that's an encouraging sign that if you get a full split of that, if that just carries over into summer, that you definitely have somebody there in Roamer. Like, he is a borderline LCS caliber mid laner, and even if I'm talking about him as like, I thought he was going to be better, he at worst is like a top 3 mid laner in the NACL. He still has the potential to absolutely decimate this level of competition, and I think there is still a possibility for him to show up and just really show out for TLC this split, get an LCS offer, and be starting next year, even with the league contracting. So definitely going to be interesting to see there. The other part of the team that I actually feel pretty good about is the bot lane, and I know that feels weird with the rankings, but Spawn, Kimdown, you just kind of know what you're going to get out of them. They're not going to be perfect every single game. I think Spawn has kind of proven who he is as an AD carry at this point, but I really value consistency, and Spawn offers that in spades. He's really not the player that's going to have a lot of these super highs and super lows. He's just going to be very consistent, very in the middle. He's going to have a lot of really solid performances, and one thing that I really value for Spawn, and the reason that he does rank so high in a role that is incredibly strong in the NACL, is because he is kind of a known clutch performer, like a playoff performer at the very least at this level. He is somebody who has always stepped it up in high pressure moments, whether it be for Dignitas, whether it be here for Team Liquid, this past spring, but also, of course, the last time he was on Team Liquid. Spawn has just always been someone you can rely on in high pressure situations, and I think that that is an incredibly valuable trait. That being added on to the fact that he is a very consistent performer in the regular season means that I do think that he is going to be one of the higher floor AD carries. I feel very good about having Spawn on the team, and Kimdown is Kimdown. I really don't have a ton of issues with him either. A little bit more of that feast or famine style. He'll have a couple of bad games here or there where, he'll engage a little bit more aggressively than maybe what the rest of his team is willing to follow up on, but for the most part, he's going to play within the structure of, where they want to put a lot of their resources, and he's going to be an enabler in the late game, and I think that that generally is just what this team needs. They have carry threats. Roamer is a carry threat, Jenkins is a carry threat, which we will get into, and honestly, Keel is a carry threat. One of the things that I think will really tilt this team either forward or backward is whether or not Keel can start getting back to what he was last year for Wildcard as opposed to what he was in the regular season, where he kind of just became every other jungler. Like, I know that feels like a negative, and oftentimes I'm not trying to overemphasize the weird picks coming out of the jungle position, because I understand, like, sometimes it's just better to learn and to play meta because it's more consistent on a game-to-game basis. But Keel came over here to Team Liquid as a player who thrived on a lot of these weird off-meta picks that we kind of know him for, Nunu, Karthus, like these things that he's become very famous for. And Team Liquid kind of took a lot of that away. He didn't really get a chance to play any of those weird off-meta picks. He definitely played a lot more standard for a majority of the spring split. And I don't really want to see that out of Keel. I want to see Nunu. I want to see Karthus. I want to see him play comfort, and I want to see him get the opportunity to carry games for this team. They put a lot of responsibility on the solo laners to do a lot in the regular season in terms of damage dealing. I really do think you can trust Keel to be the secondary damage dealer behind Roamer on this team, and you can win a lot of games that way. We saw it with Wildcard in 2023. Keel can be an MVP level player if he's given the keys, and I really do think that hopefully this is kind of the split that unlocks him. Karthus is super meta right now, and so if I'm Team Liquid, like, I'm it's a pick or ban against TLC at the moment because it really is that strong. But Keel is somebody that I think if he shoots back up to being like a number 2 or a number 3 jungler, which is super realistic, by the way. Again, these are floor rankings. I think, Keel's floor is a little bit lower than some of the other junglers we'll talk about, but his upside is right up there with them. If he can shoot back up to number 2 or number 3 in terms of the jungle rankings, be an MVP candidate, Team Liquid's going to be way better than this ranking. And then Jenkins in the top lane, I've always been a little bit lower on Jenkins because, again, he is a little bit more feast or famine. That's just kind of general for North American top laners, especially the ones here in the NACL, is that they're going to have good games, they're going to have bad games. Jenkins very much likes his own individual style. He's been known for his Rumble and his Ken and his AP top laners, and that's fine. That's a good situation to have. I think he did a really good job of actually carrying games down the stretch in the playoffs. He was really, really good in that run. He was probably the player that impressed me the most in terms of their playoff run, but Jenkins has just always been a little bit inconsistent, which is why his number is going to suffer. He's not a negative towards this team at all. There are just so many good top laners. I think some people might see number 5 and see that as disrespectful for Jenkins. It's just, you know, kind of a law of numbers at this point. There are too many good top laners. He comes in right below players that, you know, very much could make a case to be in the LCS right now. And, you know, I just don't know if Jenkins is exactly there with him in terms of like, oh, I feel super good about this guy and he could take an LCS spot at the moment. I think that there are a lot of good games, a lot of good traits. I just want to see it more consistently, and that's always been the issue for Jenkins, even going back, you know, to CLG days, and even before that, Golden Guardian stuff, back when he was, you know, Bob Jenkins at the start of his career. He's always just been a little bit inconsistent, but this is a really solid lineup across the board. I know it feels weird to say that about the number 6 team, because 6 is kind of low in a 10-team league, but there are so many good rosters put together here in the NACL that coming in at number 6, like, that's a team that could absolutely win the NACL if everything were to go right. If Romer makes that next big leap, which I think they're really kind of waiting for, if that happens, they can win the NACL. I think if Kiel gets re-unlocked to what he was last summer, they can win the NACL. Jenkins is good enough to win with. Spawn and Kimdown are good enough to win with. Like, this team absolutely could be champions. It just needs to take a little bit more progression from the players they put a lot of trust in at the beginning of the year. But now moving into the top 5, number 5 in my power rankings. Again, a team I feel is very similar to number 6, and honestly, like numbers 3 and 4. I think they're all in this little cluster where they're all really, really talented, but I want to see how they play as a unit. Coming in at number 5 for me, though, it's going to be Supernova. I think this might be seen as high for some people. This might be seen as low for some people. I think 5 is relatively fair in terms of a floor for this team. I really like the best players on this team. The new additions coming in from Fear, I think, could be very positive for them overall if they continue their upward trajectory, but there are question marks about whether or not that is going to happen. You know, it's not always guaranteed that young players who had a good split are going to be able to carry that through if they have not been consistent for a significant period of time. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. First and foremost, we got to get some pictures on these guys. They are way too good and way too known in the tier 2 scene to not have pictures. Faisal doesn't have a picture on Leaguepedia. What are we doing? Like, there were so many players in this video that just don't have a public picture on Leaguepedia. I don't want to go snooping through anybody's Twitter to find pictures of them for this video, but we got to get some pictures for these guys. That's the PSA. I'm doing it in the middle of the video, but their lineup is looking like Faisal in the top lane, Kenvi in the jungle, Toasty in the mid lane, Lens at AD carry, and Diamond at support. Of course, 3 of the 5 members of Supernova last split returning, Faisal, Kenvi, Diamond, all returning to this roster, all of them coming in at number 3 in their positions, and all of them with, I guess, a real argument to be made that they should be moving up. I've seen a lot of people putting Faisal top 2, and honestly, I kind of agree. Like, at his best, he is clearly a top 2 top laner. The only reason he doesn't come into the top 2 is because, again, this is a floor ranking. It's not even necessarily what I would expect to happen over the course of the split. I think Faisal is very realistic to say that he is going to be a top 2 top laner because the skill is just there. This is somebody who has, you know, really been consistently a great, both weak side, you know, top laner. That's somebody you can put on a tank and, you know, survive 1v1, but also somebody who can just win on their own. He actually doesn't need a lot of resources in order to be super relevant in a lot of these games. We saw it on Fear, we saw it on FlyQuest. You know, it's just kind of been super consistent for him. He just beats a lot of the other players, and we've talked about, you know, a lot of the top laners being feast or famine, a lot of them having really good games, but also some really bad games. Faisal does fall into that a bit, but the difference is that Faisal is so mechanically talented. His bad games are limited because there really aren't a lot of players that can go into him and actually be able to, you know, 1v1 him in that kind of way. So he's become a mainstay in the top lane at this level, and then you have Kenvi and Diamond, who I just think are really, really good. Like, LCS caliber players that have clearly shown that they are just as good, if not better, than everybody else at this level. Kenvi, for me, was an MVP finalist in spring, and I know that feels weird to have him come in at number 3 if he was an MVP finalist for me, but I do think the situation surrounding this is going to be a little bit different for him. He's going from Shochi to Toasty. I think it's a very different type of mid laner. Shochi, obviously, somebody who was consistently going to win lane, but use that pressure to affect the map, and typically speaking, Toasty was kind of a resource carry on Fear over the past split. I think it is going to be a little bit of an adjustment for Kenvi, but I have no worries that Kenvi is going to turn into, or continue to be one of the best junglers, I should say, in the NACL. He was amazing in the spring split, won a ton of games for this team. Things didn't quite work out towards the end, and, we'll talk about that. I guess we can talk about it now. They end up getting 7th place in the playoffs. They end up going out in 7th, 8th, one of the first 2 teams eliminated in the playoffs. But as we said earlier, it was an absolute disaster draw for them in terms of the teams that they ended up having to play. They played Team Liquid Challengers in the first round, a team that, as the 6th seed, was way too good to be the 6th seed, and they got really unlucky in that matchup to just draw it in the first place. They end up not being able to take that. They move down into the lower bracket, and it's like, okay, well, at least now you're in the lower bracket, you'll play someone easier. No, you have to play the number 2 seed, Maryville University, who ends up going on a finals run out of lower bracket because they surprisingly lost to DSG. So all of a sudden, Supernova has to play Team Liquid, they have to play Maryville, and now they are eliminated from the playoffs. So yes, they did get 7th place, but I don't think that's indicative of their skill level. I think the 16-7, the 3rd place finish in the regular season, that is a lot more indicative of where that team was at. And I think Kenvi was a big part of that. Like I said, he was kind of the carry for this team in the spring split, and I would actually expect it to be pretty similar. I still think he is going to be one of the best junglers in the league. I have a lot of faith in Kenvi, but he can have bad games every once in a while. We saw it at the LCS level. We even saw it here at the NACL level, especially towards the end of the split. So something to keep in mind. And then Diamond is sticking around here. I will continue to, rate Diamond highly. I know a lot of the people who watch my channel watch the LCS, and they probably have a little bit of a different opinion of Diamond than I do because he got a rough go of it in the LCS. He was on that Dignitas team that we've talked about multiple times, just having absolutely no synergy. He was kind of the aggressive mind on that Dignitas team, and so you get into this situation where Diamond is looking to make plays on Dig, and, Centaurn and Jensen are playing incredibly passive, and things just aren't happening for that team, and he gets the blame. He gets the kind of fingers pointed at him, as the support typically does, so he's sent back down to the NACL, but he has been phenomenal at this level his entire career. He has just been one of the best supports in Tier 2, basically, for the past 4 years in a row. Diamond is a really, really solid player, and I think the big advantage to having a player like Diamond on the team is that you are bringing in 2 relatively inexperienced players, at least at the top of the standings, in Toasty and Lens. Lens has a little bit more experience than someone like Toasty does, but I think having a veteran like Diamond, having someone like Kenvi in the jungle, these players that have been here for a while, not only, in Tier 2, but, have had experience in Tier 1, I think that's going to help these players have a little bit of a better idea of where they're supposed to be in the mid game, where they're supposed to be in the late game, what they're supposed to be doing in a lot of these situations, and I think they have the talent to be able to capitalize on that. Lens is going to come in as my number 5 AD carry. At times I had him a lot lower on this floor ranking. I think Lens is a good player. I do sometimes worry about his ability to be like a game breaker out of the AD carry role. He has been really solid for, a lot of the teams that he's played for. Fear, he was really good for. Like, he was a really solid AD carry, a borderline top 3 AD carry this past split. But do I think that that is going to be sustainable now that the role is getting stronger? That is a question that I'm very interested to see how it ends up being answered. I think it was a good acquisition for Supernova to go out and get Lens. I think that he is going to be solid for this team. Again, he actually ranks pretty high in terms of the players that I would consider around him in skill level because his floor is a bit higher than some other players. He doesn't really have those horrible games. We see that a lot out of AD carries in this region. They may not be the most aggressive, but a lot of them are very consistent. The problem for Lens is, again, I just don't know if he's going to have that giant breakout season where he just starts to dominate. I think Diamond is actually a really big positive in that direction. He's helped out a lot of AD carries in his time, but it's still kind of to be determined. And then you've got Toasty in the mid lane. This guy was amazing in the spring split, and honestly, 7 feels a bit disrespectful for how good he was. He was an all-pro caliber guy in the spring split. He was a top 3 mid laner, or at least somewhere in that approximation over the course of spring. He won a lot of games for Fear as the primary carry, the resource option for Fear, and that was really, really cool to see in his first ever NACL split. He was really hyped up as a really high mechanical prospect, and it very much came through very quickly for me. I think he could be very good on this team. I'm very scared of what could happen if Kenvi and Toasty get on the same page, but the reason he does rank a bit lower in terms of floor is not only the fact that he has a much smaller sample size, like he hasn't proven over the course of multiple splits that he can be a big resource guy, but I'm just not sure if he's going to get the same kind of resources here at Supernova that he did at Fear. I think that Kenvi obviously is somebody who loves to have resources and wants to carry games. Faisal is going to want quite a few resources on the top side. It's going to be a little bit of a diminished role for Toasty from what he had in the spring split. I think he'll still be very active, and I think he could still be a really big positive for this team. But again, there are just a couple question marks, which is why in a floor ranking it might look a little worse, but Supernova is super good. I mean, you could put this team number 3, and I wouldn't complain really at all. I think that they will significantly outperform what happened in the playoffs last split. I think it was basically a disaster, like worst case scenario in almost every single facet, to see this team end up getting 7th, 8th in the spring split, and I would just be shocked if that happened again here in summer. This should be just as competitive of a team as anybody else around them in the standings. And then moving on to the top 4 for me in my personal floor power rankings, and top 4 is where it really starts to get interesting. I don't want to say that, Supernova and Team Liquid can't go out and win the NACL, because they absolutely can. They're talented enough to go out and win the NACL, but I think once you get to top 4, these are teams that really can win the NACL. Like, these are the 4 teams that I think have the expectation of winning the NACL this split. So, who's going to come in at number 4 for me? Well, it is going to be a bit of a new team. It's going to be Fear x Starforge, of course, one of the new kind of investors into the NACL, OTK, Starforge Systems, partnering up with Cincinnati Fear to end up making what is an incredibly dangerous team here, and it's going to propel them really high up in my power rankings. This team did get 5th in the spring split, but I'm not even sure that's entirely indicative of what they did. They overperformed their expectations by a lot. Their roster was not considered one of the more high floor ones going into the year, but they looked a lot better than at least I was anticipating. And Fear has done that so regularly. They have taken, whatever they've gotten, whether it's players that have not had a ton of experience at the tier 2 level and turned them into stars. We can see that in the first Fear roster from last year, or, this past split, getting players and, really kind of cultivating their talents. Like we saw Toasty in his first ever split be incredibly successful. We saw a player in Lens that they obviously sold off to Supernova, or Supernova went and got, that ended up turning out well. So, a lot of things to like about Fear, and, partnering up with Starforge, there are going to be a lot more eyes on them, and this is probably their best roster ever, which is why I'm just super excited. If their trend of overperforming their roster continues, yeah, they're going to win this split, because if you overperform this roster, it's a no-brainer. Like, you are absolutely going to win the NACL, but I'll explain why some of these numbers might look a little bit to some people who might be just kind of looking on the surface, looking at the image. But their lineup is looking like Philip in the top lane, XU in the jungle, Blaze Olive in the mid lane, Instinct at AD carry, and Winsome at support. All of these players are former LCS players. They've all had at least some regular time in the LCS. Some of them have never been guaranteed full spots. Players like Philip were filling in on FlyQuest and weren't exactly full-time starters. Instinct wasn't a full-time starter on TSM, but he was given a lot of time. Everybody else, though, has certainly been given some experience, some actual in-game time. Winsome's been on some pretty successful teams, and Blaze Olive has had a ton of time at the pro level. He's returning to tier 2 after a bit of a hiatus, and XU is coming off of an LCS split this past split. In spring, he was in the LCS as a starting jungler with a lot of positives, so there's a lot of upside to this team. There's a lot to like, and I think XU is a pretty good place to start. He's going to come in as my number 1 jungler heading into the split. It's just really hard to see his floor as anything other than that. He was so good at the LCS level this past split. He wasn't perfect. He had a couple of games where it was clear that the best junglers in the league could take advantage of some of the, adjustments that he was making in his early game pathing, but even going up against the middle tier junglers in the LCS, he was more than capable of holding his own and being able to beat them on any given day. Dignitas overperformed in a lot of interesting ways, and I think XU was a big part of that. Being able to enable bot lane, I think, was really big for Dig over this past split, and I think if XU can just carry over a lot of the traits that he had in that split to Summer, here for Fear, yeah, he could be an MVP, he could be, the first team All-Pro jungle, here in the NACL. I think that that's a pretty fair thing to say about the expectation for XU. This was a phenomenal signing, especially for what I assume was later in the offseason because of the announcements of, new Dignitas members a little bit later, but everybody else on this team is also good. It's not like you're losing talent elsewhere. You have Philip in the top lane. He's kind of the one member that's returning from this team. He has been on this team for 3 splits in a row. Now he's kind of a Fear legend, and he's been really solid for them. He has been everything they've asked him to be, and then some. There are games that he's going to be a bit more inconsistent. Again, it's just what you get at the NACL level, but his upside is there. When he wins hard, and honestly, when it comes to consistency, you are more than happy if Philip has to play weak side. He's a really good resource carry. You can absolutely, put put a lot of attention into him. You can gank top a lot. You can put a lot of resources into getting the top side of the map ahead for Philip, and he will pay that back out in the mid to late game. He's a great team fighter, but if you need him to be weak side, he can still do that at a high level. He is just a very well-rounded player. He's been showing that ever since the FlyQuest days. He is just a very, very good player to have. He's going to come in as my number 4 top laner again, because top lane is just so good at this level of competition, but I don't want 4 to feel like some sort of insult. He could be number 1 on any given day, and the same thing goes for both the Blaze Olive and Winsome. They could be number 1 on any given day. The only reason ABO ends up ranking so low for me is because we haven't seen him, in a little bit. It's been a little bit since we've seen a Blaze Olive as a starting, player. It's been the LCS that we've seen him. We haven't really seen him at tier 2 in a while, and there are just mid laners that I think are a little bit more proven in terms of like recent success. He comes in right below a player like Roamer, who was really good in the playoff run. Players like Shoji and another player that we'll talk about later are ahead of him, but a Blaze Olive is certainly not considered significantly worse than any of those players by any stretch of the imagination. I actually really love the combination of ABO and XU. I think as a mid-jungle duo, that could be one of the most dangerous in the entire league. I think playstyle-wise, it really does work. One thing I've always really admired about a Blaze Olive as a player is that he's never afraid to try and salvage a game, even in situations where it's not entirely, salvageable. We saw it a lot on Immortals when he was on that team, where the rest of the team just kind of roll over and die when they were behind. There wouldn't be a lot of situations where they would continue to try to make plays, but it doesn't really matter the game state. A Blaze Olive is going to go out there and try to win the game for you. Sometimes that can be a negative, but a lot of times that is a positive. He just has a really good mentality and never give up attitude, and it really shows on the Rift. And I'm really excited to see what he can do with someone like XU, who is really good at being able to generate those early game leads, especially when he was in tier 2 last on Dignitas. He was so good at consistently being able to win early and establish pressure for the middle of the map for, insanity on that team, that I'm really excited to see what he could do with a player in a Blaze Olive that I think is pretty similar in terms of skill level. And then you get to the bot lane, like I said, Winsome, certainly not concerned about him. This is a guy who's played for upper tier teams in the LCS. He's played for Cloud9. He's played for FlyQuest, on these kind of pseudo super teams. He has experience playing in high pressure situations. You're certainly not going to feel bad about him at your support position. Again, only coming in at number 4 because the top end of support is actually pretty strong in the NACL. It's funny because I think support is relatively like the weakest position in the LCS when you look at the, the entire depth of the position at the top level, but in the NACL, there are so many good supports that I think are worthy of promotion. Again, he comes in right below someone like Diamond, who I think very highly of, so Winsome's certainly not trying to disrespect him by putting him at number 4. The only player who I think their floor ranking might be a little bit lower than you're anticipating is Instinct. He wasn't in the NACL this past split. He was actually really good on CCG to help them qualify. Quite a few players end up helping CCG qualify and then moving on to a different roster, but Instinct was really solid for the team. I certainly have no major qualms about him. I don't know if I'm confirming that he is going to be like a star at this level. I was a fan of his when he was playing in the LCS when I was covering TSM in that final split. I actually was really talking him up. I was really hyping him up in terms of like, oh, this guy stepped into a role that was never meant for him. He's not had a lot of time to practice and communicate with the rest of this roster, and yet he is stepping in and actually filling the role very well. And he never really got an opportunity after that. His real big other chance was in the FlyQuest system, where he was playing on FlyFam in 2023, and it just didn't necessarily work out. The last time he was playing at this level, it didn't look great, but it was also a much more awkward situation. That team was not nearly as good as the rest of the league around him, and so it's really hard to sit there and kind of blame him for the rights or the wrongs of that situation. But overall, I think Instinct could easily be, again, a top 3, top 4 AD carry basically from day one here. These are, I want to reiterate, floor rankings, and I know there's probably going to be a comment like, take a shot every time he says floor ranking, but I have to reiterate that over the course of this video for the people that are jumping around, because these numbers can at times seem relatively disrespectful or seem like they're coming from a weird place. But again, this is kind of the worst that I could see these players doing, and if the worst that you could do is 4th in most positions and the best jungler, like, that feels pretty darn good for me. Fear a team and an org that is notorious for taking the talent that they have and getting the most out of them, overperforming their expectations and being a contender essentially no matter what the expectations were of them in the preseason. Now they have a legit title contending roster, especially with the things on the horizon. This could be the best split that Fear has ever had. This could be a team that ends up finishing, in the finals, even number 1 as champions, and I don't think I would be all that surprised, and I don't think any of these players would be all that surprised. I'm really, really excited to see where this team ends up going, because their expectations for the first time really are sky high. But now we get to move on to number 3 in my power rankings, and it's funny because I think number 3 for me has less upside than Fear does, but maybe a higher floor, which again is what we're ranking off of. It's going to be Disguised. It's going to be DSG. I think that this team is incredibly scary to have to play into. There are some parts of this team that I love, some parts of this team that I think are just good, and, you know, parts that I think will be generally fine for them, but the upper end talent on this team is genuinely so elite that it's almost impossible for me to imagine a world in which they perform the same way they did in the regular season this past split. I think the consistency of this team has improved with the changes that they've made, and, you know, even if I don't think their ceiling is as high with maybe their new roster, it might be, who knows, maybe it is, but I think Disguised is going to be a lot more relevant in the regular season than they were. You know, they obviously figured things out in the playoffs. They end up getting 4th place. They were really good in that run, you know, surprised a lot of people figuring things out. I think that it was kind of a long time coming for them in that regard. They had always shown flashes, but things had just never really come together for them for the entirety of these best of threes in the regular season. Again, once we got to the playoffs, it ended up being a lot better for them, but let's go ahead and talk about why I think that floor has increased for them with the new roster going into Summer Split. Their lineup is looking like Tenacity in the top lane, Yukino in the jungle, Young in the mid lane, Tomo at AD carry, and Poom at support. Of course, a lot of these players, 3 of the 5 returning from that spring team, Tenacity, Young, Poom, all returning. We'll start with Tenacity because I do think that he was the best player on Disguised by a pretty clear margin in the spring split. We knew Tenacity was going to be a very big positive for them. Returning to pro play here on DSG, this org had, you know, proven themselves enough at this level to kind of get Tenacity to come out of streaming, to come out of pseudo-retirement and get back into the pro scene. And it took him a little bit of time to get going. He really wasn't all that spectacular at the beginning of the split, but by the end of the regular season, and especially going into the playoffs, there was a really strong argument that outside of Surdy, he was the #1 top laner in the NACL. He was absolutely destroying games by the time we hit the end of the split. Like the last week or 2 or 3 in the regular season, he was maybe even better than Surdy at times. Like he really was that dominant. It just wasn't consistent throughout the entirety of the split. There's a lot of confidence in me. I have a lot of confidence that he is going to be able to replicate that for an entire split. It felt like it took some time for him to get back into the swing of playing professional games, and I think once he did, he was the Tenacity that we all kind of grew to know a couple of years ago. I think he will be just fine at this level, and I'm going to rank him accordingly. He's going to come in as my #2 top laner. He is an elite level player. And then you've got Young in the mid lane. I've always been kind of 1.5 feet in on Young. I think that's a fair way to put it. I was really high on him in spring of 2023 when I think a lot of people were still warming up to him on that Golden Guardians Challengers team. I don't think people were like all in on Young yet. I was really early on the train, and then obviously he gets picked up by DSG going into that summer split, and he is awesome for a team that really needed a really strong mid laner, and he was exactly what they wanted. He was retained, the only player retained from that team going into 2024, and he's been just as good for them. I think the mid lane talent pool is a little bit better in the NACL right now than it was, you know, a year ago. I think a couple of new additions have definitely increased the floor of that position. Players like, you know, Roamer and Blaze Olive, you know, they're back in here now. That it makes it a little bit more difficult for someone like Young to be considered a top 3 player like he probably was for a majority of not only this past split, but this past year. I still think that he can get there. He could be a top 2, top 3 mid laner super easily. I just think that, again, floor-wise, would I take his floor or Blaze Olive's floor? Probably ABO. I'd probably take Roamer's floor, like that kind of thing. Shochi's floor. Like, those are the players that I think are going to be a bit more consistent and will help out the team a bit more, at least in terms of what we've seen from them so far. But Young is still a good player. Maybe not an elite mid laner, at least in his current state. And then Poom is the other player that's returning, and Poom is honestly one of the only players that I am a bit concerned about on this team. He's going to fall a bit from his spring ranking. He was somebody who I expected to come in and really kind of regain a lot of his confidence here in Tier 2. He was sent back down to Tier 2 because things just weren't working out perfectly at the top level, was continuously given opportunities, and just never really felt like he was super, I guess comfortable really is the word. It never really felt like he was super comfortable at that level. Was always like rushed through the system. It was very famous that he was given an opportunity on 100 Thieves a lot earlier than a lot of people would have anticipated. He had only been playing League, I think, for like 2 or 3 years when he got his first shot in the LCS. He's had good opportunities on teams like CLG where he's performed okay, but it's never really all come together. I thought going back down to the NACL would get that confidence back, would show him what it's like to actually be on a winning team for what is essentially the first time in his career, and I thought that it would really revitalize him and, you know, help him grow back into an LCS player. That didn't necessarily happen in the first split. This bot lane was inconsistent to say the least, and I understand why they went in a different direction for AD carry. Not that Manui is bad, he certainly has upside, but DSG wants to win immediately immediately, and it just didn't feel like Manui and Poom had very good chemistry. As a bot lane duo, the 2v2 was just not particularly strong, and Poom needs to prove that he can get back to that level, because honestly, it really didn't look all that good in spring, especially in the regular season where things were a bit more negative. So there are concerns there. There are concerns about jungle, if only because Yukino has taken a couple splits off of tier 2 play. The last time he was in tier 2 was on 100 Thieves Challengers, and he was really good on that team. I think he actually won MVP of that split, which is pretty crazy to say if he didn't win it. I know he was in the very least in the conversation for MVP of his final split in the NACL. He's taken a couple of splits off of being, tier 2, like getting tier 2 actual games in, but he's a player that I expect to come in and be a really big difference maker for them. Perry, I love Perry. That was a very common take on this channel, as I'm ranked as the #1 jungler in the NACL going into the year. Things were just a bit inconsistent for him on DSG. He would have some amazing pop-off performances. In fact, that was a big reason why this team ended up getting better in the playoffs, as Perry started playing a lot better, but there were also some games that just did not go well for him. The inconsistency was just a little bit more, I think, for him than he had in Fear, and I think Yukino should solve a couple of those problems. Still going to be a player that looks for aggressive risks. We obviously know him for some of his more aggressive junglers, but the upside is still there, the same kind of upside that you would get with a player like Perry. I just think you're ideally getting someone that is going to lose a bit more gracefully, or at least play neutral a bit more often. Perry was often either winning or losing, and I think Yukino is hopefully going to find a better balance of that, at least for this particular DSG team. I'm not trying to say that Yukino is a better player than Perry. I'm just trying to say that he might fit this team better, and I think especially with a player like Young, I could see that working out. Yukino also has some ties to some of the other players that are on this team, players like Tenacity and Poom, who he knows through the 100 Thieves system. I imagine, that he has a lot of experience playing with these guys, Tenacity in particular, and so I think it will be a pretty smooth transition, or at least smoother than we've seen from some of the other junglers. I know 6 feels low, but I think he'll be just fine at this level. And then Tomo, he is the player that's coming in that really does raise the floor for this team, and this is why I do think the floor is so much higher, because you bring in Tomo, who was just really good at the LCS level, and I'm not trying to overplay it. There were definitely times where things were going wrong. He's not the most graceful team fighter in the entire world. In a 5v5 setting, he's not always going to make the right perfect decision, and he's not always going to be positioned perfectly to deal the maximum amount of damage. There are flaws to Tomo's game, but there were times this past split where him and Isles in the LCS were the best bot lane duo 2v2, and that is a scary thing to just bring down to tier 2, because he was doing so well in tier 1. I think Tomo very much has to come in at #1, at least for now, until proven otherwise. There's really no other way for me to rank that, because he was so good in the LCS. His aggressive laning is kind of what he is known for, and every single time he's played at this level, he has done really well, whether that's been for Fly, whether that's been for Dig. Basically, whatever team he has been on has been successful at this tier 2 level, and he's been successful at the LCS level as well. I think you have to imagine that this is going to be an upgrade to the bot lane, if only because Tomo really is just that good. I think Yukino could theoretically be a consistency upgrade to the jungle, specifically on a game-to-game basis, and then I'm really high on Tenacity. I think Young's a really good player. If the bot lane can be good, if Poom can kind of bounce back from what was a, slower spring split, I would say, especially in comparison to what the expectations were for him as a player, DSG absolutely can win the NACL. This team is more than talented enough to win the NACL. I've seen people even putting them at #1 in terms of their power rankings. To me, they are a team with a pretty high floor. I think that's a good way to look at them. You can look at a team like Fear Starforge, and I actually see maybe a bit more potential in a team like Fear Starforge if everything was to go right, because I think XU plus a Blaze Olive could be very scary. Philip is about as good as Tenacity, or at least in the same ballpark as Tenacity on the top side of the map, and maybe you could see the bot lane overperforming, especially because I think Winsome is such a good player. But DSG's floor is just so high. Tomo plus Tenacity, even plus Young, you are going to win a lot of games with that 3-man core that I think a lot of other teams just aren't going to have. And so I would not expect a 9-13 summer split in the same way that you had it in spring. I don't think you need to go on a crazy, shocking playoff run. I think it will just be a very good regular season, and the expectations will go back up for this team. But that's going to bring us to our top 2 teams in my power rankings here, and it's the 2 finalists from the previous split. It's not going to be too shocking in that regard. I think these 2 teams have to be looked at the very least, as the 2 favorites going into the split, but by how much? I think that gap has closed, but Still coming in at number 2 for me, it's going to be the other major new partner in the NACL. It's going to be Dragonsteel. And of course, if you're not familiar with the changes that have happened over the course of this split, Dragonsteel, Brandon Sanderson partnering with Maryville University to kind of come together and make Dragonsteel. It's essentially the same Maryville University roster, except now a new top laner in there. Niles is out of the starting lineup. He has become the head coach of the team, and Zamudo is stepping in to play in the top lane. Certainly kind of a matching of styles. Two aggressive top laners that do like to kind of punish matchup advantages that they get in draft, and I imagine a lot of, drafts will go their direction. A lot of R5s are going to go the way of top lane here for Dragonsteel, just like they did for Maryville in the previous split, but Zamudo definitely has some more questionable moments that I think definitely need to be shown they can be weeded out. I have a lot of faith that that will happen, but again, floor rankings aren't always the kindest in terms of the numbers, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is, of course, looking like Zamudo in the top lane, Yuji in the jungle, Spyrax in the mid lane, Scary Jerry at AD carry, and Zyko at support. There are a couple of players on this team that might seem a little high, or maybe even a little low in terms of their rankings, depending on how you feel about them, but, we'll talk about Zamudo first because we've already kind of started the conversation. Zamudo's always been a very interesting player to talk about on this channel in particular because the talent is clearly there. The mechanics are clearly there, and we've talked about it a lot when we've covered Zamudo on every single team that he's played for here in the NACL over the past little while. It's never been a problem of, oh, can he win at this level? Yes, he absolutely can. He can honestly dominate at this level if everything were to go right. The problem for Zamudo has always been consistency. It's being able to limit what those bad games look like in the worst of situations. And honestly, he had quite a few bad games over the course of this previous split. There were multiple times where I was just asking him to rein it in a little bit, to allow the rest of his team to do some creative things in draft to, allow other lanes to flourish. And Zamudo was just kind of the focal point of every single game that he played. And that's always going to be a little bit of a plus, a little bit of a minus for him as a player. I think coming into Dragonsteel here is actually a super good situation. This is a very cohesive team that plays off of each other in a very, coherent way, and I think that Zamudo will hopefully benefit a lot from that. If this team is going to be enabling top a little bit more than maybe they were doing in the spring split, I think that could really help Zamudo. He definitely likes to have resources. He's not quite as consistent when he is left on an island in 1v1s, but if you can get the most out of Zamudo, he has the talent to be at the top, top 2 top laner in the NACL. He could at floor be like a number 4 or number 5. I've seen a lot of people ranking him around that area in terms of player rankings, and I think that that's super accurate. But again, from a floor perspective, from like what's worst case scenario for him, I think worst case scenario for him is a little bit lower than maybe some of the other players that we're going to see in this upper echelon of teams. That being said, again, the upside is there, and I understand completely why he was the player that they wanted to go with if Niles was going to move to the head coaching position. So I don't hate the addition, especially because you have such consistency surrounding him. Yuji and Spyrax have been playing together for so long now. They were brought up essentially through the FlyQuest system, but, also being kind of super big newbies coming into the FlyQuest system. Both of them were brought in at the exact same time, and they have grown together as players, and I continue to believe that both of them are some of, if not the best players in their role. Yuji was incredible this past split. He's going to come in as my number 2 jungle. Honestly, if you wanted him at number 1 over XU, I could kind of understand that. I think it's a pretty reasonable take to say that that's something that you could believe. For me, he's going to come in at number 2, but only just barely. The upside of Yuji being able to take over games has skyrocketed. I was really in on Yuji in summer of last split, and he was just as good for Maryville in spring of this split. Was really happy to see him get a starting spot. It wasn't always confirmed that he was going to be the guy here for Maryville this past split, but it was the right choice, and he clearly proved that right, being an MVP level player here for Maryville. I think he will continue that here for Dragonsteel. And then for Spyrax, I'm going to continue to die on this hill. I know this isn't exactly the most common opinion that you are going to see for the NACL, but I will continue to say that Spyrax is the most impactful mid laner, at least right now in the NACL. I get it that his laning isn't the most dominant. Like 1v1, he's not what like Quad was for FlyQuest last split. Hell, he's not even really what like Shoji is, or what I would expect someone like a Blaze Olive to be in the 1v1. I think that there are going to be circumstances in which he's just kind of a guy and isn't quite as dominant in that phase of the game, but as somebody who impacts the game, who affects the map and is able to enable his jungler, I'm really not sure there is anybody better in the NACL right now, and that's a style that I just don't think there is a lot of in the NACL. There's not a lot of that in North America, especially in Tier 2, so I think Spyrax kind of stands out in that regard. When you go back and watch, especially a lot of the Maryville games from last split, you are watching Spyrax constantly be first to every single fight in the right position, allowing his jungler to position a lot more aggressively, and really enabling his team to just kind of push forward. Scary Jerry and Zyko benefited from it as well, because this team did want to put a lot of resources into the bottom side of the map, and Spyrax being able to, make sure that he can get those roams off in a cohesive and fast way was a big reason why this team was so successful in the early game. I think Spyrax is underrated. I can understand why people, don't rate him as highly as maybe some of the other mid laners, like a Roamer, who is probably just more mechanically talented than Spyrax, but to me, it's just hard for me to watch the tape and not see somebody that's impacting the game more than any other mid laner at this level right now. So he's going to come in as my number one mid laner, even if that is a bit of a controversial take. And then the bot lane of Jerry and Zyko. Talk about development over the course of this past split. We always knew the upside was there. I had hyped these two up a lot when Maryville first came into the NACL. Jerry was somebody that I talked about with this ridiculous mechanical ceiling if you are able to get the most out of his consistency, and Zyko was a player I always thought had a pretty high floor, was somebody who, coming into the league, I thought was going to be a really good support, and, neither of those things turned out to be the case in year one. Like, it definitely took some time, but this past split, everything clicked, everything came together, and both of them were some of the best players in their positions without really any sort of competition. Both of them were excellent. I think there was a strong case to be made, and a case I will make, that they were easily the best bot lane in the NACL in the spring split. I would expect them to continue to be the best bot lane in the NACL going into summer. I'm not going to spoil the ranking at number one. I mean, you know who the team is. I'm not going to spoil the player rankings, but, they're grading out as the best average bot lane. Like, 2-2 is going to be the strongest bot lane in the NACL in terms of my grades, and I think that will keep up. Jerry is just so mechanically talented. He's going to be able to go toe-to-toe with basically any ADC, and especially if you give him resources, if you ask him to 5v5, he's going to win that 5v5. He was really good in that role last split, and I just think Zyko is such an underrated player. He is so good in the support role. I think he really is somebody that is going to get a lot of LCS looks at the end of the year. I think both of these guys will get LCS looks, or at least I'm hopeful that they will, because I think both of them have shown that development path, that growth together as a duo, and also the individual skill as individuals. So Yuji and Spyrax is a great duo mid-jungle, being able to enable a great duo in the bot lane. If Zamudo can come in and just be solid for this team, he doesn't even really need to be a superstar. If he can come in and either, grow on that weak side role if they want to play that, or alternatively, level up that consistency and, grow into more of a Surdy type of player, I think Dragonsteel could absolutely be champions. We saw the upside with Maryville this past split. We saw them make finals. We saw them clearly be a top 2 team in the NACL. I think at least until proven otherwise, I'm going to believe that they're going to keep one of those top 2 spots, even if there are some reasons to believe in regression. I do think this team is definitely going to play a bit different, but it's really hard for me not to believe in them in the same way that I did in spring. But that's going to bring us to our number 1 team in my power rankings, and this is not going to be a surprise to anybody. It's the reigning champs from the spring split in the NACL. It's FlyQuest Challengers. There's really no reason for me not to pick them as the number 1 team with the highest floor. I think this team dominated for a reason in the spring split. They were clearly, in my opinion, the best team in the NACL, and I don't really see any reason why that would change. I understand mid lane is definitely going to be a question mark. Quad was so dominant at this level. Are you going to get the same kind of production out of anybody, let alone Bradley, who just qualified, to the NACL again? But I feel pretty confident that the rest of this team is talented enough for you to be able to overcome the fact that Quad is no longer on this team, and I think Bradley's going to be a very suitable replacement. He is a super talented mid laner, and I do think that it will be generally fine for them. So we'll go over it. Their lineup is looking like Surdy in the top lane, Shaden in the jungle, Bradley in the mid lane, Sajed at AD carry, and Chime at support. This is still the most talented roster in the NACL, in my opinion, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have what is, in my opinion, the clear number 1 player in the NACL in Surdy right now. I've seen some discussion, some takes, some discourse online about whether or not Surdy actually is as good as advertised. He is. Like, I think it's always funny to see how the moment a player starts to get hyped a lot, that's the moment that a lot of the haters and the pushback starts to come out. I get that Surdy's been talked about, like, how is he not in the LCS? And that can be a bit annoying for some other NACL players that also are LCS caliber. I think that it can definitely be kind of a one-sided conversation when you are only referring to Surdy as a player that deserves to be in the LCS, but I think the reason that conversation is taken over is because he is mechanically so much better than everybody else at this level, and his upside, getting him in an LCS organization, getting getting him, experience and time at the top level, it just feels like is a no-brainer. Like, getting him into your building feels like a no-brainer, but, I understand FlyQuest why they would want to hang on to him. This could potentially be a starter for them going into next year, if that's the decision they want to end up making. Surdy really is the best player in the NACL right now, at least in terms of what I would anticipate, and he's going to come in as my number 1 top laner pretty easily because of that. He just is super good. I don't even feel like I have to go into detail on why. He just dominates laning phase, and he dominates team fights harder than anybody else in the NACL does. He's the complete package at this level. I get that there are going to be some performances where he's a little bit, overmatched. Top lane's generally a more volatile role in the NACL because of the other players at this position, because counter picks matter so much, especially in Fearless Draft. It can sometimes be a game-to-game kind of thing, but Surdy is, for the most part, probably the most meta-independent top laner that you could get at this level, and I really value him. I think he's going to be just fine. You've got Shaden in the jungle. He's going to come in a little bit lower than maybe you would expect in these rankings, if only because, like I've said a billion times in this video already, it's a floor ranking, and Shaden's floor is just a little bit lower than the other, top-tier junglers. But you know what? Shaden was arguably, a top 2, at minimum, jungler this past split, and so it's not like we don't know what it looks like when Shaden plays well. Really, the only times we've seen any sort of inconsistency coming in from Shaden has been on Evil Genius's challengers, and that team just generally, bred inconsistency. It felt like that was just what they offered as a team, but even when it was working on EG challengers, it worked really well. He was awesome on Cloud9, awesome on EG. He's been amazing here for FlyQuest so far. He was supposed to be in the LCS alongside Surdy at the beginning of the year before the contraction of the league down to 8 teams. He has shown over the course of this year why that was the right decision alongside Surdy, so I feel no worries about that. There are going to be some games that he's not the most consistent in because that's just who he is as a jungler. Bit more of a feast or famine player, which is why he does rank a bit lower than some of the other top tier junglers like Kenvi, like UG, like XU, who I think are a bit ahead of him, but it is relatively close, and he will outperform those players on any given day. I'm not worried about the talent there. And then I'll talk about the bot lane first. We'll get to Bradley last, the new player, but Sajed and Chime were solid. I certainly didn't have any major issues with them. Sajed came in and was just as good as anticipated. I know a lot of people had high expectations for him. I had seen him play at a very minimal level, watching him going into spring, but he was really solid. I don't think he was a star for this team. He didn't need to be, though. This team was winning through mid. They were winning through top. They were winning through jungle. He could be, I guess, kind of the low resource carry of this team, and they could still be incredibly successful. I imagine he will fill a similar role, although I do think he might have an increased role, at least slightly, because of the mid lane situation, and so we could potentially be seeing more responsibility go his way for some late game carry situations, but he was still really, really solid. I don't think there was anything negative for me to say about Sajed. He did everything he was supposed to in the opportunity he had. He just didn't have the same kind of opportunity that some of the other AD carries had around him, so he's going to go to number 4 in my rankings there, and then Chime's going to stay at number 1. Chime is still just too good for this level. He has announced that this is his final split as a professional, which is a little bit sad. I think he very much should be in the LCS. The rumor had it that he was supposed to be in the LCS at the beginning of the year before the contraction, and it's definitely a bit unfortunate that he doesn't have a spot and that his last split will be spent here in the NACL, because I really do think he should just be an LCS talent, but I understand why moving on to a different career might be the option. The ecosystem is evolving in a way that is definitely a lot more uncertain for a lot of these players, but Chime is really, really freaking good for this level. He's going to come in as the number 1 support. I don't even think that's really all that debatable right now. He is just really, really solid. He's good in every phase of the game. He's a great laner, great roamer. That's really where he's optimal. He's great at playing with his jungle. I think that that's his best trait, but it's not like he's bad in the 2v2. It's not like he's bad for peeling for his AD carry in team fights. He can just do a bit of everything. Very solid player. No real negatives to speak of. He was my highest graded player in the NACL going into the year, and he is still in the top 3 for what I would expect to see in them. The only change, like I said, you're going from Quad to Bradley because Quad got promoted to the main team. Bradley's definitely a bit of a different style. You're not going to be getting the same kind of dominant laning impact that you got out of Quad because you just can't really expect that out of anybody, but Bradley is about as good of a substitution as you could possibly get. Again, requalified with CCG. He's the final of 5 players that we talked about in today's video to requalify. He was playing off of Yukino really well in that tournament, and I think that leads me to feel pretty confident about his ability to play off of Shaden, who I think has a pretty similar playstyle. Shaden can actually be a bit more feast or famine than Yukino, but the hits actually work even a bit better, and I think if Bradley can come in and just enable the rest of this team, let alone win on his own in the mid lane, I think that this team will be just fine. I'm expecting the floor for Bradley to be high. The last time we saw him in the NACL as a top laner, he was really good. He was one of the better top laners in the league for Team Liquid, and I'm not really concerned that he's going to come in and struggle in terms of mechanics getting back to his natural position at the tier 2 level, so You know, I feel good about Fly. I know there's going to be some conversation about whether or not they should just be defaulted the #1 spot because they were champions. I'm not defaulting anybody in the #1 spot. Anybody who's watched my LCS Primer video knows that I'm not just going to put the champion at #1 just because they won the league. I'm going to put my opinion, but it's just really hard for me to see any other team having a higher floor than FlyQuest going into this split. Their team is stacked basically from top to bottom. They don't really have any clear weakness. They don't have a player that I think you could easily exploit, and I think at the very worst, this is going to be one of the most competitive teams in the league. So at least for now, I think Fly has rightfully earned the spot here at the top of the power rankings. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2024 NACL Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We went over all 10 NACL teams. I'm super excited for the NACL here in the Summer Split. Full Fearless is crazy. I'm super excited to see how that ends up working out. I think it's going to make the regular season a lot more chaotic, and it certainly will make best of fives a lot more chaotic. The fact that we're getting more best of fives in the playoffs, I think, is a good thing overall, and the changes are definitely interesting to see what happens. But would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on everything down in the comments section below. I guarantee you do not have the same opinion as me if you are watching this video. I know that my opinions don't always exactly line up with what consensus is, so I would love to know what you agree with, what you disagree with down in the comment section below. Of course, respectfully, I have some people that come in here and they're like, you've clearly never watched any of these games, you clearly don't know any of these players. I'd like to imagine that my channel history shows that I've at least watched a couple games from these players, but that being said, again, I'm happy to have those conversations down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the video, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering the NACL every single week on this channel, weekly reviews of every single game that ends up happening. We do the same for all 4 of the major regions as well, LCS, LEC, LCK, LPL, every single week on this channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.